All right, so now that we know all about closures, now we're going to look at a specific type of closure that is often used with web requests called a completion handler. All right, so we're back in our star trivia project. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of this stuff that I was using to talk about our problem last time. I'm going to remove the return, and I'm going to remove this right here as well. All right, so now we can build that, and that is working. This error is unrelated to this project. Not sure why it's showing up. All right, so let's start talking about completion handlers. Remember, the problem we are trying to solve is how to know when a time-consuming process, such as a network request, is complete, and how to then get that information where it needs to be. Specifically in this case, we have our function, getRandomPersonURLSession, that creates and runs a web request. We are hitting the Swappy API, we're getting data back, we're parsing that data, and creating an instance of our person from that data. But now we need to know when this is all complete, and then we need to get that information over to our selectPersonVC.swift file and use that to populate the UI. Okay, so to illustrate completion handlers, we're going to make some simplified mockups of our two classes in question, the person API that does the network request, and the select person VC that will be calling that request and wanting to use the resulting person from that network request. Okay, so I'm going to create a new playground here, and we're going to use a blank, and we're going to call this completion handlers, and I'm going to say create. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this variable here, and let's go ahead and create a person API class here. Okay, so I'm going to say class person API. Remember, this is just a simplified version of what we already have, and in there we have a getRandomPerson function, right? So I'm going to say func getRandomPerson, and we pass into it maybe a URL of type string. And then here inside of this function, we do some network requests, and that's going to take a while, right? So I'm just going to write here, perform time-consuming network request. Now, it's not like super time-consuming as far as we are concerned. It's milliseconds, but it's still slower than our synchronous code executes. All right, so I'm going to illustrate that here in just a second. To simulate the network request time consuming part, I'm going to go ahead and add a time delay here. I'm going to say dispatch queue.main.async after deadline. And so what this is doing is this is going to put a time delay on a background thread with a time delay of, and we're going to say now, or .now, plus 2. Okay, so we're giving it a 2-second delay. And then once that's finished, I'm going to print out network request completed. Okay, so this represents a network request. This is the time delay. All right, so now let's create our view controller class. I'm going to say class VC, and in this class we are going to go ahead and initialize a person API. So I'm going to say person API is equal to person API. And then we are going to have a action that occurs when the user presses the random button, right? So I'm going to say func random button pressed. Okay, and then in here, we are going to use our person API instance to get the random person. And we'll pass in a URL, something like www.swappy.com. Okay, not a real URL, but that's fine. And then, so what I want to show you here is how this is an asynchronous request right here. Okay, so we're going to print here about to start request. And then we begin the request where the print network request completed is printed out. And then here we're going to say print network request has started. Okay. If I run this, what you should expect to see is this be printed out, about to start request, then we begin the request here, but this will not be printed before this. So we should see about to start request, network request has started, and then once this has finished, then we will see print network request completed. Okay, so I'm gonna run this, or I guess I need to initialize a view controller. So I'm gonna say let VC equal VC and initialize that. And then we're gonna say VC dot random button pressed, okay? And just to reiterate, this class right here is a simplified version of this class here where we have the actual URL session request, and then the view controller is equivalent to this select person VC where we are making that call here, okay? All right, so now if I run this, let's see what we get. All right, so we see about to start request, network request has started, and then 2 seconds later, after this has after this time delay has occurred, we see printed out network request completed. Okay, so this illustrates exactly the problem that we are trying to solve. We have a time-consuming process that we need to know when it is finished. And so for that, we are going to use something called a completion handler. But before we start diving into the jargon for that, let's just use what we learned in the last lesson, which is to pass functions in as arguments, okay? So I'm going to add a second parameter here to our getRandomPerson function, and I'm going to say completion, and I'm going to give it a function type, right? So that is an input and a return type. So I'm going to input a Boolean and a person object. But first we need to go ahead and create a simplified version of our person. So I'm going to say struct person, and we'll just give it one property. It doesn't need to be the full person structure that we created in the other that we created for reals. And this is going to be of type string. And we are going to return nothing. So you could either do void or you could do empty parentheses. They are the same thing. Okay, so now we have added a parameter that has a function type, right? So now down here, this is saying that it's missing an argument for parameter completion in call. So if I click on this and press fix, that will add it. And now what do we do here? Well, let's go ahead and create a function called completed. And we need this function to have the same type as this parameter up here, right? So we are going to pass into it a Boolean. So I'll call this success of type bool, a person of type person, and we return nothing. And what do we want to do here inside? So this Boolean here, this is to let us know whether or not the request was successful. And if it was successful, then we should also have a person object. So I'm going to say something simple like if success is equal to true, then print person.name. All right, great. And then you remember that we can pass in functions as arguments. So I'm going to pass this function completed as an argument to this getRandomPerson function. All right, so right here I'm going to say completed. So now when we call this function getRandomPerson, we are going to have a 2-second delay, and then we are going to call completion, and we are going to pass into it Boolean true, and we'll just initialize a person object right here. We'll say person with the name of Johnny B. Okay, so we are calling this function type here and passing into it true and a person object. All right, so this is new though. This is saying that a closure use of non-escaping parameter may allow it to escape. So what is this escaping thing about? A closure is said to escape a function when the closure is passed as an argument to the function, but is called after the function returns. When you declare a function that takes a closure as one of its parameters, you can write escaping before the parameter's type to indicate that the closure is allowed to escape. Okay, so if I click on this and say fix, then you'll see that it was added right here at escaping, and the error goes away. One way that a closure can escape is by being stored in a variable that is defined outside the function. As an example, many functions that start an asynchronous operation, such as our web request here, take a closure argument as a completion handler. The function returns after it starts the operation, meaning we have started the operation, but the closure isn't called until the operation is completed. The closure needs to escape to be called later, in other words, down here. Okay, so we add this at escaping key here, and now if I run this, let's see what happens. So we have our two print statements, then we wait 2 seconds, and then network request completed is printed, and then we see printed Johnny B. So let's take a look at the flow here. All right, we call person API get random person, and that goes up here. We have our 2-second delay. Once that is finished and we get our results, so to say, we call our completion and we pass into it our two parameters that we expect, a Boolean and a person object. And then that is passed into this function down here, which does something. In this case, we check to see if it was successful, and if true, we print out the person's name. All right, so that is a completion handler. Now, you might notice that this looks a little bit different than some other completion handlers you may have run into. So let's turn this into a closure, all right? So you remember how to turn this into a closure? First step is we remove the func keyword and the name. We take this curly brace and we put it at the front, and then we add the in keyword, all right? And then we can take this whole thing and replace it right here. All right, there we go. So now let's go ahead and run this again, make sure we get the same results. Wait for 2 seconds, and there we go. All right, so now we can go ahead and use the optimizations that we learned in the last lesson, meaning that we can remove the types and the return, and then we can do a trailing closure and close off with a close parentheses after the input. Then we can remove the completion name, and then we can remove this ending parentheses here. All right, perfect, and that is looking pretty great. Now if we run this again, we get our two print statements, and again we get the result. All right, so this is shaping up real nice. Now you don't have to go through all of that we just did. For instance, if I comment this out and I call that same function again, person API dot get random person URL, and I go ahead and give this a URL, and then I tab over and I press enter, you'll see that we get the expected auto completion. So here you can go ahead and give this a name, success, and this you can give a name, person. And you can actually give it whatever names you want, all right? So this should be looking familiar to you. Now if we go back to our project and we take a look at person API.swift, look at this right here. This is a function that has a completion handler. Okay, we have the parameter that we pass in the URL. We have this open curly brace, and then we have these 3 parameters here. Then we have the in keyword. In fact, if we command click on data task with, and we go to jump to definition, you'll see here something very similar. We have data task with URL, and then we have a completion handler. We have at escaping, and then we have the 3 input parameters here, data, and these are the types. and then it returns void. That's just like what we have over here. We have our completion at escaping the input parameters, and we are returning void. So that's pretty cool. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. If success, if success, then my autocomplete's not working. I think it, for some reason, Playground doesn't like when you have comments. Okay, so I'm gonna say print person.name. All right, so we're back to where we were before. All right, so now I'm gonna introduce you to something called type aliases. We have this bit of code right here, and we could simplify this. Up here, we can create something called a type alias. All right, and a type alias is simply giving a type a different name, an alias. So for instance, to start out simple, I could say something like type alias, and I could say Johnny string is equal to string. And then for whatever reason that you would want to do this, you could say var name of type Johnny string is equal to Johnny B. Okay, so all you're doing is just reassigning, giving the string type an alias called Johnny string. So rather than have this little bit of code right here, let's go ahead and create a type alias for that. Let's say type alias, and we'll call this person response completion. And the type expression will be just what we have right here. So I'm just going to cut that and paste it right there. And then here at escaping, we will have person response completion. Okay, so basically it's just taking this and assigning it to this name as a type alias, and we use that here instead. Just kind of cleans it up a little bit. All right, great. Now let's take everything that we've learned here and go apply it to our actual project. So I'm going to come back over here into our person API. And here we have get random person URL session. So we are going to need to have our completion here. But let's go ahead and make that a constant. I'm going to come into our list here with our constants. I'm going to say type alias, and we're going to call this, again, person response completion, and that is going to be of type person, and we're going to make this optional, and then we are going to return nothing. We're going to return void, okay? So now let's go back into our person API, and here we are going to do completion at escaping and person response completion. Okay, so now where do we want to call completion? Right here, after we get our person instance, we can call completion, and then we pass in the person that we just initialized. So now when we come into our view controller here, when person API, the instance of the person API class, is called and the get random person URL session instance is called. I'm going to go ahead and delete this actually and say get random person URL session, then press return, and now we get our inputs. We can say person, and then here we can say encode. Now remember, I made this optional, and that's because it's possible that here in the person API that something goes wrong and the person is never initialized. We could have a JSON problem, we could have an error with the URL session, and so that's why I made it optional, because what we could do here now is we can say completion and we can pass in nil, okay? So that way we will be able to know here in select person VC if something went wrong. So we can say if let person equals person. Now we can actually start setting up our IP outlets. We can say, well, let's just test this first. Let's say person.name. All right, and that should be all we need to do. Let's go ahead and test this. Oh, I didn't actually print that. I need to say print person.name. There we go. Now let's run it. There we go. Luke Skywalker. All right, so let's go through this flow once more, okay? So here in the view controller, we initialize an instance of our person API. We call getRandomPersonURL session, which initiates a web request. We give it the URL, it goes and makes the request, we get back the data, we do the parsing, and finally, once that's all done, we say completion. And that's when it escapes this function and goes into our select person VC here, where we then have access to that thing that we passed into our completion handler, and then we can do what we need to do with it. All right, so hope that kind of clears up completion handlers. In the next lesson, we'll go ahead and hook up the random button and populate our UI labels. All right, so I'll see you then.